The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape of the Arizona Territory, painting the red rocks in deeper shades of crimson. The year was 1887, and the small frontier town of Cedar Falls had grown around the precious water source that gave it life, a clear river that wound through the desert like a silver ribbon. Sarah Whitmore sat at the river's edge, her worn calico dress spread around her like wilted petals. The fabric, once a cheerful blue with tiny white flowers, now seemed as faded as her hopes. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, each one carrying the weight of a world that had crumbled around her in just 3 short weeks. The water moved steadily past her, indifferent to her pain, carrying away leaves and small twigs, just as life had carried away everything she held dear. Her husband James lay buried in the small cemetery behind the town's church, claimed by the fever that had swept through Cedar Falls like wildfire. The bank had already come calling about their small homestead, and yesterday she'd received word that her younger brother, her only remaining family, had been killed in a mining accident in Colorado. At 23, Sarah felt ancient, hollowed out by grief that seemed too large for her body to contain. She'd chosen this spot, a bend in the river hidden by cottonwood trees, because she thought no one would find her here. She needed to break apart without witnesses, to let the pain pour out of her without having to be strong for anyone else. The sound of a twig snapping made her freeze. Through her tears, she saw a figure emerging from the tree line, tall, lean, moving with a quiet grace that spoke of years spent reading the land's subtle signs. He was Apache, she could tell immediately, his long black hair bound back, wearing a mixture of traditional and acquired clothing, buckskin pants, a simple cotton shirt, and moccasins that explained his silent approach. Sarah's first instinct was fear, not of violence, but of judgment. The relationship between the Apache and the white settlers had been complicated and often tragic. Many in town spoke of the Apache with suspicion or outright hostility. Though a few families had learned to coexist peacefully, she didn't know which category this man fell into. But as their eyes met, she saw something unexpected. Recognition, not of her personally, but of the universal language of grief. His dark eyes held their own weight of loss, a depth that spoke of understanding hard-won through experience. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space of perhaps 20 feet. Sarah's tears had stopped from surprise, but her breathing remained ragged. The Apache man studied her face with the same attention he might give to tracking signs, reading the story written in her tears and the slump of her shoulders. Then, without a word, he moved closer, slowly, respectfully, like approaching a wounded animal. He stopped at the water's edge, several feet away from her, and simply sat down on a large, smooth stone. He didn't speak. He didn't stare. He simply settled into the kind of patient stillness that suggested he had nowhere else to be. Sarah found herself caught between confusion and something that might have been comfort. In her world, when someone found you crying, they either demanded to know what was wrong or offered quick, often useless reassurances. This man did neither. He simply offered his presence, asking nothing in return. The river continued its ancient song, and slowly, very slowly, Sarah felt her breathing begin to calm. The Apache man sat as still as the rocks around them, his eyes moving between the water and the distant hills, giving her the gift of space, while making it clear he wasn't leaving. As the sun began to sink lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah realized that for the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of her loneliness had lifted just slightly. She wasn't alone with her grief anymore. Someone sat witness to it without trying to fix it or explain it away. And in that shared silence by the flowing river, something began to shift. Not healing, not yet, but the first tentative possibility that healing might someday be possible. The Apache man's name was Nahale, which meant one who helps in his language, though Sarah wouldn't learn this until later. He had been returning from checking snares near the river when he'd heard the soft sounds of crying carried on the wind. His own recent losses, his wife and infant son taken by the same fever that had claimed Sarah's husband, had left him intimately familiar with the sound of a heart breaking. For 3 days, he returned to the river at the same time, always finding Sarah there, always taking his place on the smooth stone. On the first day, she had stayed only a few minutes after his arrival before hurrying back to town, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. On the second day, she'd remained longer, occasionally glancing at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. By the third day, she seemed to find his presence as natural as the sound of the water. It was on the fourth afternoon that Sarah finally spoke. "I don't know why you keep coming here," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. I'm not good company right now." Nahale turned his head slightly toward her, considering her words with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. When he spoke, his English carried the rhythms of his native tongue, precise and thoughtful. "The river does not ask the rocks to be good company," he said simply. "Yet they sit together for many seasons." Sarah blinked at this, something in his words resonating in a way she couldn't quite name. "That's not the same thing." "Is it not?" Nahal's eyes returned to the water. Both know the other's pain, both remain. For several minutes they sat in their accustomed silence. Then, as if a dam had finally cracked, Sarah began to speak in a rush of words that seemed to tumble out of their own accord. "My husband died 3 weeks ago. Fever. He was going to build us a real house come spring. Not just the cabin we had, but a real house with glass windows and a front porch where we could sit in the evenings." Her voice caught. "And my brother, my little brother Tommy, he went to the Colorado mines to save money for his own land. There was a cave-in. I got the telegram yesterday." She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small. "I thought I could be strong enough for this life. James always said I was tougher than I looked, but I don't feel tough. I feel like I'm made of paper, and everything that touches me tears right through." Nahale listened without interruption, his stillness somehow absorbing her words and holding them safe. When she finished, he was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think she'd said too much, shared too much with the stranger. Finally, he spoke. "My wife was called Ayana. It means eternal blossom. She died in the fever time, and our son with her. He lived only 2 days. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the careful control beneath it. "The missionaries said her spirit was in a better place. The medicine man said she walks the ghost trail to be with her ancestors. Many people had words about where she went." He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hands, examining its smooth surface. "But I think the dead live in what they gave to the living. Ayana gave me the knowledge that love is possible, even when the world is hard. My son gave me understanding of hope, even when hope is brief." Sarah found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something in his voice that spoke of pain transformed rather than simply endured. "The paper feeling," Nahale continued, "it comes from trying to hold too much water in hands that were made to let things flow through them. Grief is like the river. It must move, or it becomes something that poisons instead of cleanses. But how do you let it move?" Sarah's question came out as barely more than a whisper. "How do you let it go without losing them completely?" Nahale set the stone down gently beside the water's edge. "You do not let go of them. You let go of the part of grief that says they should still be here in the way you expected. You keep the part that says they mattered, that they changed you, that love happened and was real." As the sun continued its descent, Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, not the absence of pain, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that pain and love could coexist, that one didn't negate the other. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe a little deeper. A week had passed since their first real conversation, and Sarah found herself looking forward to these afternoon meetings by the river. The townspeople had begun to notice her daily walks, and some, particularly Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store, had started asking pointed questions about where she went and why she looked less peaked than she had in weeks. Sarah deflected these inquiries with vague mentions of finding the river air helpful, but she knew it was more than that. In Nahali's presence, she was learning a different way of existing with her grief, not fighting it or hiding from it, but allowing it to be part of the landscape of her days. Today, she'd brought something with her, a small photograph of James that she'd been unable to look at since his death. It sat in her lap now, face down, as she worked up the courage to turn it over. "I brought something today," she said, when Nahali arrived and took his usual place on the stone. He waited, as he always did, giving her space to share what she felt ready to share. "It's a photograph of my husband. I haven't been able to look at it since we buried him. I keep thinking that if I look at it, I'll fall apart again. But if I don't look at it, I'm afraid I'll forget his face." Nahali nodded slowly. "Among my people, we have a custom. When someone dies, we avoid speaking their name for a time, to let their spirit travel unbound by our need for them. But there comes a moment when we begin to speak of them again, not to call them back, but to honor what they gave to our lives." Sarah turned the photograph over with trembling hands. James looked back at her from the small frame. Young, hopeful, his eyes crinkled with the laugh lines she'd loved to trace with her fingertips. The sight hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to keep looking. "He was 26, she said softly. "He came west because he believed in new beginnings. Said the land out here was honest. It gave you what you worked for. Nothing more, nothing less." A tear slipped down her cheek, but her voice remained steady. "He made me laugh every single day. Even when the crops failed that first year, even when we barely had enough food to make it through winter, he'd find something to make light about. He sounds like a man who understood that joy is not the absence of hardship, but the decision to find light, even in difficult times," Nahal observed. "Yes," Sarah said, surprised by how exactly this captured James's spirit. "Yes, that's exactly what he was like." She studied the photograph more closely, and for the first time since his death, the memories that came weren't just of his final fever-racked days, but of the 3 good years they'd had together. The way he'd sung off-key while working in their small garden. How he'd insisted on carrying her over the threshold of their tiny cabin, even though they'd been married in the courthouse, with no ceremony. The morning she'd found him trying to teach their cat to shake hands, convinced that all creatures could learn something if you approached them with enough patience. "I think," she said slowly, "I think I've been afraid that remembering the good times would somehow dishonor his death, like I wasn't taking it seriously enough." "In my understanding," Nahali said, "the greatest dishonor to the dead is to let their death erase the meaning of their life." Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something she'd been too lost in her own pain to notice before. Despite his own losses, despite the weight she could see he carried, there was something unbroken in him, not untouched by grief, but not destroyed by it either. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you carry loss without letting it become everything you are?" Nahal was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow around a partially submerged log, the water finding its way around the obstacle without fighting it. "I think," he said finally, "grief becomes lighter when it has somewhere to go. For me, it goes into caring for others who need help, into making sure Ayana's kindness continues in the world through my actions, into teaching young men in my band how to hunt and track, so my son's future is honored in the futures of other children." Sarah felt something click into place, an understanding that was both simple and profound. "You're saying that grief can become generative, instead of just destructive. Grief that only takes and never gives back becomes a poison that spreads," Nahali agreed. "But grief that finds ways to honor what was lost, that becomes a different kind of medicine." As the afternoon light began to fade, Sarah found herself thinking not just about her losses, but about what James and Tommy had brought to the world while they were in it. James's unfailing optimism, his ability to find humor in hardship. Tommy's curiosity about everything, his letters full of excitement about the new places he'd seen and people he'd met. Perhaps, she thought, there was a way to keep those qualities alive in how she chose to live forward. "I've been thinking about leaving Cedar Falls," she said suddenly, "going back east to my aunt in Philadelphia, starting over somewhere that doesn't remind me of everything I've lost." Nahal turned to look at her directly. "And what does your heart say about this plan?" Sarah considered this seriously. I think it says I'd be running away from the pain, but also from everything that made the pain meaningful. James loved this place. He saw possibility here that I'm just beginning to understand. "The land holds all our stories," Nahal said simply, "the joyful ones and the sorrowful ones. To leave is not wrong, but to leave only from fear means carrying that fear wherever you go." As they sat in companionable silence, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would stay in Cedar Falls, at least for now, but she would stay differently than before, not as someone hiding from life, but as someone learning to live it fully, even with a heart that would always carry the tender places where James and Tommy lived on. 3 months had passed since that first afternoon by the river, and Cedar Falls was showing its autumn colors. The cottonwoods had turned golden, their leaves catching the light like scattered coins, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Sarah walked toward their meeting place with purposeful steps, carrying a small cloth bundle. In the weeks since she'd decided to stay, she'd thrown herself into rebuilding her life, not as it had been, but as it could be. She'd started taking in sewing and alterations, discovering she had a talent for intricate work that brought in enough money to keep the cabin and small plot of land. More importantly, she'd begun to find ways to honor James's memory through action. The town's children, many of them struggling with the limited schooling available, had become her special focus. Sarah had started an informal reading group that met twice a week in her cabin, teaching children and some adults who'd never had the opportunity to learn. She'd written to the Territorial Education Board about establishing a proper school, using James's dream of improvement and growth as fuel for her own determination. But perhaps the most significant change was the friendship that had grown between her and Nahali. Their daily meetings had evolved from shared silence to conversations that ranged from practical matters. He'd helped her repair her roof before the winter storms. She'd mended tears in his clothing with careful, neat stitches, to deeper discussions about healing, purpose, and the ways that loss could teach as well as take. Today felt different, though. Nahal had mentioned that his band would be moving to their winter camp soon, following the seasonal patterns that had sustained his people for generations. Their daily meetings would end, at least for a time. When she reached the river, she found him already there, but not on his usual stone. Instead, he stood at the water's edge, holding something in his hands. "I brought you something," he said as she approached, echoing the words she'd spoken months ago when she'd finally shown him James's photograph. He held out a small carving made from white stone, a figure of a woman sitting beside flowing water, her face turned toward the sky. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail carved with patient care. "I began this the day we first met," Nahali explained. "I saw something in your face that reminded me of Ayana when she was learning to be strong again after losing her first child, a baby who came too early and could not stay. She had the same look of someone deciding whether to let grief drown them or teach them to swim in deeper waters." Sarah accepted the carving with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of it was surprising, both heavier and more delicate than she'd expected. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but I don't know what I've done to deserve such a gift." "You learned to sit with pain without running from it," Nahal said simply. "You learned to let grief move through you like water instead of damming it up until it turned bitter. And you found ways to honor your losses by giving something back to the world." Sarah looked up from the carving to meet his eyes. I learned those things from you, from watching how you carry your own losses. We learned them together, he corrected gently. Healing is not something that happens alone. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the water and the rustle of golden leaves in the breeze. Sarah felt the weight of transition in the air, not an ending exactly, but a shifting into something new. I have something for you too, she said, unwrapping the cloth bundle she'd brought. Inside was a carefully sewn shirt made from soft cotton in a deep blue color. I know you have to follow your people to the winter camp, and I wanted you to have something to remember our friendship. Nahale accepted the shirt with the same careful reverence she'd shown his gift. He ran his fingers over the even stitches, the neat buttonholes, the way she'd reinforced the shoulders and cuffs for durability. This is made with great skill, he said, and great care. I wanted it to last, Sarah said, then felt her cheeks warm at how that might sound. But Nahale understood. All good things are made to last, in one way or another. Sometimes in the object itself, sometimes in what it teaches us, sometimes in how it changes us. They walked down to sit by the water one last time in their old positions, Sarah on the bank, Nahale on his stone. But the dynamic felt different now. They sat, not as broken people seeking comfort, but as friends who had helped each other find ways to be whole again. Will you come back in the spring? Sarah asked. The river will bring us both where we need to be, Nahale said, which wasn't quite an answer but felt like a promise nonetheless. I've been thinking about what you said about grief becoming medicine, Sarah said. I think I understand it better now. The pain doesn't go away, but it becomes useful. It helps me recognize when others are struggling. It makes me want to help in ways I never did before. And what will you do with this understanding? Nahale asked. Sarah looked out over the water, thinking about the plans that had been growing in her mind, like seeds finally finding good soil. I want to establish not just a school, but a place where people can come when they're struggling, where children can learn to read, but also where adults can find work if they need it, or just sit quietly if that's what they need. I keep thinking about how you just sat with me that first day, not trying to fix anything, just being present. I want to create a place where that kind of healing is possible. Nahale smiled, the first full smile she'd ever seen from him, transforming his entire face. That sounds like something Ayana would have loved to help with, and something James would have been proud to see you build. As the sun began to set, painting the river gold and red, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion, not of her grief, which she understood now would always be part of her, but of this particular chapter of learning how to live with it. Thank you, she said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't fully express. Thank you, Nahale replied with equal sincerity. They sat together until the stars began to appear, two people who had found in each other not romance or rescue, but something perhaps more precious. The recognition that healing was possible, that loss could coexist with hope, and that sometimes the most profound gift we can offer another person is simply our presence in their pain. When they finally parted ways, Sarah walked back toward town, carrying not just Nahale's carving, but a new understanding of her own strength. She would continue to grieve James and Tommy. That love demanded nothing less. But she would also continue to live, to build, to help others find their own ways through the dark waters of loss. The river would always be there, flowing steadily toward whatever came next, carrying away what needed to go and nourishing what needed to grow. And Sarah would be there too, changed but not broken, ready to offer others the same patient presence that had helped her find her way back to herself.